Hi, I'm Jeff Stark. Thanks for being with me today. In our last video, which was numbered number 4 on the series of quarreling and fighting, we were very fortunate to be able to look into the Epistle of James, who addresses this matter of quarreling and fighting in chapter 4, verse 1, when he says, "What causes quarrels and fights among you?" The purpose of James' purpose in writing that is to communicate to Christians what is the cause and the origin of why you and I quarrel and fight with one another, our husbands, our wives, our children, or other people. The first thing that we saw that James identifies the reason why I quarrel, or maybe you quarrel, of course, or others that you know quarrel, is because of these very strong desires that we have inside of us. They're mentioned in chapter 4, verse 1, where it says, "What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires?" And we're going to come back to that in just a moment. He says, secondly, you want something, and that word means that we want something very, very badly. We could even say we crave it. And then number 3, he says in verse 2, you kill and you covet. And the word covet is a very strong, passionate word talking about boiling, burning on the inside, a very, very strong word used to indicate very strong passion and desire on the inside. And all three of those feelings contribute to and cause, James says, why we quarrel and why we fight with others. James is being very helpful here. Normally, when we say, why did I quarrel and fight in a particular situation, I would blame my circumstances. I would say it was because the other person was behaving like a jerk. But James is very helpful here to point the finger not at the other person as to why I quarrel and fight, but to point the finger at myself and for you to point the finger at yourself. Now, before we move on to the second reason why James says we quarrel and fight, we're just going to take a step back and look at these three desires one more time, but we're going to look at one. And the first one that we talked about was in chapter 4, verse 1, which says this: "What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you?" Now, that word desire is really the word for pleasure. And it's kind of a curious thing. It might cause you to scratch your head and say, wait a minute, why do pleasures cause me to quarrel and fight? We're going to take a look at this one word here just for a few moments, this word pleasures, and give you an idea as to what that means and what James is talking about and why pleasures can cause you to be one who is quarrelsome and one who would fight and argue. Okay, so here's an example that we can draw upon to learn from this passage and from this particular word and how it applies to us. Let's take an average guy who enjoys sex with his wife. Not all pleasures are bad. Some pleasures are actually very, very good. Some pleasures God has ordained that we would be able to enter into and enjoy and take pleasure in. And we would say that sex is one of those. God created sex. It's a pleasure. It's an enjoyment and something to be done with the right person at the right time in the right way. But nonetheless, that's found to be pleasurable. Now, so what is James talking about here when he says that these pleasures cause us to quarrel and fight? Well, here's what happens. Pleasure is, sex, I should say, is a pleasure that we are meant to enjoy. But in this, the pleasure, I'm going to say, is going to be measured in this way. We have sex, it comes with pleasures, and we are to enjoy those pleasures. However, in this case, this pleasure has grown to become this big and this powerful in a man's life. Okay? Now, when a good pleasure, a reasonable pleasure, a proper pleasure, and a proper measured pleasure in the area of sex is good, but when I take that matter of sex and the pleasure in sex and I make it this big, well, now I'm in for trouble. What happens, so we're taking a good pleasure, but we're turning into a bad pleasure because now it's something that's far too strong and far too important. And it turns out to be a craving, and it turns into a demand. So when a husband who has this kind of sexual pleasure and approaches his wife to engage in sexual activity. If she says, no, not tonight, I got a headache or whatever reasons, he's going to say, okay, he's going to be able to prayerfully dismiss that for the night and move on to go to sleep and wake up the next day. However, if this man is approaching his wife with a desire and a pleasure for sex that's this big, and his wife says, no, not tonight, I'm not interested, and maybe tomorrow. Well, he has something that this powerful, a pleasure that this powerful in his life. But his wife is saying no, and James says, don't they come from your pleasures that battle within you? You want something, but you don't get it. You kill and covet. So what's this mean? If the man has taken a good pleasure for sex, but turned it into this big of a pleasure for sex, and now he's craving it, but his wife, and he approaches his wife, and his wife says, no, not now, maybe tomorrow. Well, he wants it very, very badly, very, very badly, and if his wife says no, then he's going to get very, very angry. He's going to quarrel with her. He's going to fight with her. He's going to say things like, well, you're my wife and your body doesn't belong to you and you should do it to me and you owe me this. And he's going to get very demanding and very selfish about the matter. Quarreling, he's going to fight. And James says this. He says, you want something, but you don't get it. You kill and you covet. Killing? Murder? What's going on here? Well, James is saying that when we have these pleasures, like, for example, in the context of sex, and our spouses say no, we're going to be very, very angry. God looks at the heart of that angry man, and he sees murder. You remember in Matthew chapter, in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, you heard that you shall not commit murder, but I say if you're angry at your brother in your heart, you've already committed murder. Well, that's what James is alluding to here, is that this man is not shooting his wife because she's not having sex with him, but in his heart, Jesus sees killing and murder. Why? Because sex, he's not getting sex? Not really. He's got a pleasure concerning sex that has grown to be this big and is very consuming and very demanding on his part at this point. His wife is saying reasonably, no, I'm not interested. We'll do it tomorrow perhaps. But he wants it. He's craving it. He's demanding it because it's become a pleasure that's this big. His wife is saying no. And so what's going to be coming out of him, because he's not getting what he wants, what's coming out of him is quarreling with his wife, fighting with his wife, arguing with his wife, manipulating his wife, and getting very, very angry at his wife because she's not having sex with him? No, because he's not getting what he wants. The problem lies within him, not in his wife. Okay? That's one example of how these desires can get us into very big trouble, but also how these inordinate desires for good things like sexual pleasure can grow and become too big and too strong. And if I don't get it, I'm going to be very angry and I'm going to take it out on my spouse and even blame them for why I might be angry. Okay, I hope that's helpful. That's just one example of how James is talking about a pleasure, a reasonable pleasure, a sexual pleasure, but it can become so big when I don't get it. What comes out of me because I'm not getting what I want is quarreling, fighting, arguing, and killing, and murder, and anger, and things like that. I hope that's helpful to you. That's just one example in what James is talking about here in terms of how these desires, inordinate, sinful desires and cravings, when I don't get them, how what's going to cause to come out of me in those situations are going to be quarreling, fighting, and anger and argument. Okay, I hope that's helpful. Now, what that man's got to do is he's got to say, I've got to stop blaming my wife for that. What's the problem is that this pleasure is too important to me. It's a good thing, sex. It's a good pleasure to enjoy, but it's become too important to me in such a way that if I don't get it, then I'm going to kill and covet and be angry and argue. Now, what you would want to do in that case is the next day, I hope that this husband would understand this and go back to his wife and say, look, I want to ask you to forgive me for last night. Maybe I had been thinking about sex all day and it was exciting. I was coming home. I was excited about being with you in that way. And what was a good thing had become a very important thing and become too important to me. And when I approached you and you said no, I got very, very angry. Honey, that was not your fault. It was my fault. I took a good pleasure. I turned it into an inordinate pleasure. And when I didn't get it last night, I got very angry. And I have no one to blame for my anger but myself. And I want to ask you to forgive me for the way that I behaved last night. Okay, that would be very appropriate for the husband to do. Instead of waking up angry and going to work angry and coming home angry because his wife didn't give him what he wanted, no, it's a very different situation. James is trying to introduce us to the differences here about being angry with your wife over such a thing, as opposed to saying that the problem was really a good pleasure that became too important to me. Okay? What you want to do in lieu of this video is examine, well, what kinds of other pleasures do I have in life that I allow to become too big in my life? And when I don't get those pleasures, I'm denied those pleasures, I find myself getting angry and quarrelsome and argumentative. You want to try to examine those things in your own life and follow in the footsteps of the husband who understands these things and goes back to, in this case, his wife and God, and apologizes and asks forgiveness for the way that the quarreling and the fighting and the arguing and the anger came out of him. It wasn't about her. It was about what was going on inside of him. I hope that's helpful. In the next video, we'll look at the second reason James gives. The first one are all these desires and passions and cravings. But we'll look in our next video the second reason why James says we quarrel and fight with one another. See you then.